Hospital waiting rooms are supposed to be places where families come together during tough times, right? Well, mine became the setting for the most awkward detective story ever. After our wreck around 7:30 a.m., while my wife was recovering 3 feet away on morphine, I was forced into detective mode and uncovered her secret relationship. And let me tell you, solving this mystery while your spouse is sedated creates a level of uncomfortable tension that no one prepares you for. But this whole mess didn't start in that hospital room. It began the night before with what seemed like the most innocent decision in the world. The snow day that changed everything. My wife announced she wanted to spend the evening with her best friend Rebecca despite a snowstorm that had meteorologists practically begging people to stay indoors. She insisted this was their last chance to catch up before our planned Florida cruise and promised they would just have a few drinks at Rebecca's place and stay put until morning. I remember watching the snow pile up against our kitchen windows while she got ready. Something felt different about her energy that night, though I couldn't pinpoint what. She seemed more excited than usual about a simple girls' night, taking extra time with her makeup and changing outfits twice. When I suggested she should probably stay home given the weather conditions, she waved off my concerns with a laugh that sounded forced. She kissed me goodbye and promised to text me when she arrived safely at Rebecca's house. The text came an hour later, short and simple. Made it safe, having fun, see you tomorrow. I settled in for the evening, assuming my wife was curled up on Rebecca's couch sharing gossip and wine while the storm raged outside. Our kids were already at my parents' house for the weekend, so I had the rare luxury of falling asleep to complete silence. I woke up around 5 in the morning to use the bathroom and decided to check if the snow had stopped. Pulling back the bedroom curtains, I expected to see my wife's car buried under a foot of fresh powder in our driveway. Instead, I stared at an empty space where her vehicle should have been. The snow had stopped falling hours ago and the plows had already cleared our street. There was no reason for her car not to be there unless she had never come home. My first instinct was concern, not suspicion. Maybe she had decided to stay at Rebecca's rather than risk driving in the early morning hours when the roads might still be icy. I called her phone twice and got voicemail both times. The messages I left were casual and caring, asking her to call me back when she got the chance. I made coffee and waited, checking my phone every few minutes for a response that never came. By 8 o'clock, my concern had shifted into something closer to worry. By 9, I was putting on my boots and coat to drive across town to Rebecca's house. Apparently, I trusted my ride more than my spouse in a snowstorm, because the roads were better than I expected. I drove slowly and carefully, rehearsing the gentle teasing I would give my wife about making me worry for nothing. Rebecca's neighborhood looked like a winter postcard, with snow-covered lawns and icicles hanging from gutters. Her house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, and I could see my wife's car parked in the driveway next to Rebecca's sedan. Both vehicles were covered with several inches of snow, confirming they had been sitting there all night. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I pulled up to the curb. The front door was unlocked, which struck me as odd given that Rebecca was usually security conscious. I knocked softly and called out hellos as I stepped inside, not wanting to startle anyone who might still be sleeping. The living room showed evidence of the previous evening's activities. 2 wine glasses sat on the coffee table next to an empty bottle, and throw pillows were scattered on the floor as if someone had been lounging there watching television. I called my wife's name and heard no response. The house felt too quiet for 2 people who had supposedly spent the night drinking and talking. I checked the kitchen and found it empty except for a few more wine glasses in the sink. The silence was starting to feel heavy and strange, like the air before a thunderstorm. I climbed the stairs toward the bedrooms, calling out again to announce my presence. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the hardwood steps. The master bedroom was empty, bed still made from the day before. The bathroom was empty too. I stood in the hallway feeling confused and slightly anxious. Where exactly were they? I had seen both cars in the driveway, so they had to be somewhere in the house. I walked toward the guest room at the end of the hall, still calling out their names softly. The door was closed, which seemed normal if they were sleeping. I turned the handle quietly, expecting to peek in and see 2 friends passed out on the bed or couch, still in their clothes from the night before. Instead, I was about to discover that sometimes the most innocent actions lead to the most devastating revelations. The door swung open silently, and I found myself staring into a room that would change everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my wife, and my life. What I saw in that guest room would haunt me for months afterward, replaying in my mind at the most unexpected moments. It was the kind of scene that burns itself into your memory with perfect clarity, every detail preserved like a photograph you can never throw away. I stood in that doorway for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, my brain struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. Everything I had believed about my wife, about our relationship, about the life we had built together, was about to crumble in the space of a single heartbeat. The guest room revelation. Two shapes under the covers caught my eye first. My wife should have been alone if she had crashed here after drinking with Rebecca. The covers were pulled up high enough that I could only see the tops of two heads against the pillows, dark hair on both figures, which seemed consistent with my wife and Rebecca both being brunettes. I stepped closer to the bed, planning to gently wake my wife so we could head home. The room smelled different than I expected, carrying a heavy scent that wasn't just wine and perfume. Something about the atmosphere felt charged in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. The silence was too complete, too deliberate, like people holding their breath rather than actually sleeping. One of the figures shifted slightly under the covers, and I realized the proportions looked wrong for Rebecca. The shoulders seemed too broad, the frame too large. Rebecca was petite like my wife, but this person appeared significantly bigger. My confusion deepened as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I reached for the comforter and pulled it back gently. Instead of finding my wife and Rebecca sleeping off their drinks, I discovered my wife's head resting on the bare chest of a man I had never seen before in my life. Her arm was draped across his torso in an unmistakably intimate position. They were both naked under the covers, their clothes scattered on the floor around the bed like evidence of frantic undressing. The scene hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My wife, the woman I had been married to for over a decade, was cuddled up with a complete stranger in Rebecca's guest room. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an innocent explanation gone wrong. This was exactly what it looked like, and what it looked like was the most predictable cheating scenario imaginable. My brain seemed to short-circuit for several seconds. I stared at them without moving, waiting for this to make sense somehow. Maybe I was still asleep and having the world's most vivid nightmare. Maybe the stress of the snowstorm and worrying about my wife had caused some kind of hallucination. The man stirred slightly and opened his eyes, probably sensing someone standing over the bed. He looked up at me with the confused expression of someone trying to place a face they don't recognize. My wife remained asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful like someone without a care in the world. The contrast between her serene expression and the chaos exploding in my mind felt surreal. What happened next remains mostly blank in my memory. I lost complete control and beat the guy until Rebecca and some half-naked stranger wrestled me off him. When the fog cleared, the man was unconscious with scratches on his cheek and neck, and my knuckles were bleeding. Rebecca was screaming at me to calm down while my wife sat on the bed with a sheet wrapped around herself, crying hysterically. The next clear memory I have is sitting in Rebecca's living room while someone called 911. My wife had thrown on some clothes and was kneeling next to the unconscious man, checking his pulse and trying to wake him up. She kept looking over at me with an expression that mixed fear, guilt, and desperate pleading. I felt completely disconnected from everything happening around me, like watching a movie where I happened to be one of the characters. The rational part of my mind understood that I had apparently beaten a man unconscious, which should have terrified me. Instead, I felt nothing except a strange emptiness where my emotions used to be. My wife's sobs sounded muffled and distant even though she was only a few feet away. The paramedics arrived and loaded the man onto a stretcher after determining he had a concussion but would probably be fine. He regained consciousness before they carried him out, though he seemed disoriented and couldn't remember much about what had happened. The police took statements from everyone and decided not to press charges since the man didn't want to pursue the matter further. My wife and I found ourselves alone in Rebecca's driveway after everyone else had left. She started talking immediately, words tumbling out in a desperate rush to explain or apologize or somehow undo what had just happened. She claimed this was the first time, that it didn't mean anything, that she loved me and wanted to work things out. The explanations sounded hollow and rehearsed, like she had been preparing for this conversation without realizing it. I unlocked my car and got in without responding to anything she said. After a moment of hesitation, she climbed into the passenger seat. We both understood that appearances had to be maintained, at least until we figured out what came next. The kids would be expecting both parents to pick them up later. Neighbors would wonder why my wife wasn't coming home. There were logistics to consider even when your marriage had just exploded. Neither of us acknowledged what had just happened or discussed what we were going to do about it. We both knew that conversation was coming, but neither of us was ready to have it yet. I started the engine and pulled out of Rebecca's driveway, the snow crunching under my tires as we headed toward what would become the second most traumatic event of our morning. From betrayal to twisted metal. The most uncomfortable car ride of your life doesn't compare to sitting behind the wheel with your cheating wife in the passenger seat, both of you pretending this was somehow a normal Tuesday morning. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white, partly from the driving conditions and partly from the rage still coursing through my system. My wife kept stealing tearful glances at me, probably trying to gauge whether I was going to explode again or just drive us both off a cliff. She had stopped her frantic explanations after realizing I wasn't responding to anything she said. Now we sat in this bubble of toxic silence, both aware that our marriage had just died, but neither of us knowing how to pronounce it officially dead. Every few seconds she would open her mouth like she was about to say something, then close it again when she realized there was nothing left to say. What exactly do you tell your husband after he catches you naked with another man? I wasn't driving recklessly, despite what anyone might assume about a man who had just beaten someone unconscious and discovered his wife's affair in the span of 20 minutes. If anything, I was being extra cautious because I kept zoning out and losing focus on the road. My brain felt like it was running on dial-up internet, struggling to process the information overload from the morning's events. The route back to our house required taking the highway for about 10 miles, then exiting onto smaller roads. Traffic was light because most sensible people were staying home during the snowstorm, but the few vehicles on the road were moving slowly and carefully. I had just merged onto the highway when my wife finally broke the silence with a whispered apology that sounded more like a question than a statement. I didn't respond because I honestly didn't trust myself to speak without screaming. My throat felt raw from whatever I had yelled at Rebecca's house, though I couldn't remember saying anything coherent. The fury from earlier had settled into something colder and more controlled, but I could feel it waiting just beneath the surface. I was thinking about how I was going to explain this situation to our kids when a pickup truck appeared in my rearview mirror, moving much faster than the conditions warranted. The driver seemed to be having trouble maintaining control, weaving slightly between lanes like someone who was either drunk or overconfident about their vehicle's abilities in the snow. I moved into the right lane to give him plenty of room to pass us. Instead of passing, the truck started sliding sideways as the driver apparently hit his brakes too hard. I watched in my mirror as the vehicle began to fishtail, then swing completely around until it was skidding backward down the highway. The driver overcorrected and sent the truck careening across both lanes directly toward our car. I had maybe 3 seconds to react. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right to avoid the out-of-control truck, but the sudden movement sent our car into its own skid on the icy pavement. We slid sideways off the highway, hit the guardrail at an angle that sent us airborne, then crashed through the metal barrier and flipped down a steep embankment. The car rolled before slamming into a massive oak tree that stopped our momentum with a sound like thunder. The silence afterward was absolute, except for the hissing of steam from our destroyed engine and the gentle patter of snow falling through the broken windshield. I hung upside down in my seatbelt, disoriented but apparently conscious and functional. My wife wasn't making any sounds at all, which scared me more than my own injuries. Whatever anger I felt toward her evaporated instantly when I saw the unnatural angle of her left shoulder and the blood trickling from her mouth. I managed to unbuckle myself and crawl over to check on her, though moving sent sharp pains through my ribs and back. She was breathing but unconscious, trapped in her seatbelt with what looked like serious chest injuries. The passenger side of the car had taken the worst impact when we hit the tree, crumpling the door and roof around her seat. I could hear her breathing was labored and wet-sounding, which I knew was a bad sign. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had spent the morning wanting to strangle my wife, and now I was desperately trying to keep her alive until help arrived. I called 911 from my phone, which had somehow survived the crash, and tried to explain our location to the dispatcher. The whole time I was talking, I kept checking her pulse and trying to determine if moving her would make her injuries worse. Emergency responders took nearly 40 minutes to reach us because of the weather and the remote location where we had crashed. By the time they extracted us from the wreckage and loaded us into ambulances, my wife had regained consciousness briefly but seemed confused and disoriented. The paramedics were concerned about internal bleeding and possible lung damage from her broken ribs. I rode in a separate ambulance with relatively minor injuries, mostly cuts from broken glass and bruises from the impact. The EMT kept asking me questions about what had happened, but I found it impossible to explain that we had crashed while driving home from discovering my wife's affair. Instead, I just said we had hit some ice and lost control, which was technically true if incomplete. At the hospital, they wheeled my wife into emergency surgery while I got stitched up and x-rayed in a different room. The doctor told me I was incredibly lucky to have escaped serious injury, while my wife would need multiple procedures to repair her crushed shoulder and collapsed lung. As I sat in the emergency room waiting area, I realized that the car accident might actually be the least complicated part of what had turned into the worst day of my life. Hours later, when they finally moved her to a recovery room and told me she was stable, I found myself facing a decision I never thought I would have to make. The nurses were expecting me to take my place as the devoted husband keeping vigil at her bedside. They had no idea they were about to assign me the most uncomfortable chair in medical history. The world's most uncomfortable hospital vigil. I found myself stationed beside her bed like some kind of twisted sentry, 3 feet away from my heavily sedated wife, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed while monitoring her vital signs. The irony was suffocating. 6 hours earlier, I had wanted to throttle this woman with my bare hands. Now I was holding vigil like some devoted spouse while she recovered from injuries sustained during our escape from the scene of her betrayal. A nurse told me most people wouldn't spend all night in the waiting area, but here I was, refusing to leave my wife's side. She had no idea I was staying because I genuinely didn't know what else to do with myself, not because I was some paragon of marital devotion. The nursing staff treated me like I was husband of the year, stopping by every few hours to comment on my dedication. My internal monologue had become a twisted comedy routine. While the nurses praised my commitment, I sat there mentally debating whether I hoped she would recover quickly or take her sweet time so I could figure out my next move. The oxygen mask covering half her face made her look vulnerable and innocent, which made me even angrier because I knew what she was capable of when conscious. Every time her breathing seemed to labor, I experienced this awful split between genuine concern and wondering if this was karma finally catching up to her. The medical decisions fell to me as her next of kin, which created the surreal experience of authorizing treatments for someone I now considered my enemy. When the surgeon explained the procedure needed to repair her collapsed lung, I had to sign consent forms while mentally calculating whether her recovery would complicate the divorce I was already planning. The doctor interpreted my hesitation as worried concern rather than internal conflict about whether I cared if she lived or died. I actually found myself Googling, "Can I sign divorce papers in the ICU?" while pretending to research her medical condition. Her moments of consciousness were the worst part of this whole ordeal. She would drift awake for a few minutes at a time, disoriented from the pain medication but aware enough to remember what had happened that morning. The first time she opened her eyes and saw me sitting there, she started crying immediately. Through the oxygen mask, I could hear her trying to form words that sounded like apologies, though the medications made her speech slurred and barely comprehensible. I found myself responding to these attempts at conversation with the kind of gentle reassurances you would give to any injured person. I told her not to try to talk, that she needed to rest and focus on healing. The words came out automatically, like muscle memory from 14 years of marriage. Meanwhile, my brain was screaming that this woman had destroyed our entire life together and didn't deserve my comfort or concern. Yet there I was, adjusting her blankets and asking nurses if she needed more pain medication. During the longer stretches when she was unconscious, I had nothing to do but think about everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Sitting in that uncomfortable chair, I started mentally reviewing years of memories and questioning which ones were real. Had she been cheating during our anniversary dinner last month when she seemed distracted? What about all those late nights she claimed to be working on projects for her job? How many times had she lied directly to my face while I believed every word? The machines monitoring her vital signs became a strange soundtrack to my realization that I had been living with a complete stranger. Her heart rate would spike sometimes when she was dreaming, and I wondered if she was reliving her affair or having nightmares about the car accident. Either way, I was watching the physiological responses of someone whose inner life had been completely hidden from me despite sharing a bed for over a decade. When she was awake enough for brief conversations, she kept trying to explain what had happened at Rebecca's house. The pain medication made her emotional and loose with details she probably wouldn't have shared otherwise. She admitted this wasn't the first time she had cheated, though she claimed it was only the second. She insisted she loved me and never meant for me to find out this way. Each revelation felt like another punch to the gut, delivered by someone who could barely keep her eyes open. By the second day, I had reached a strange state of emotional numbness that made the whole situation feel like watching someone else's life unfold. I could observe myself going through the motions of being a caring spouse while simultaneously planning my exit strategy from the marriage. The disconnect was so complete that I started wondering if I was having some kind of psychological break from reality. The worst part was how natural it felt to slip back into our old dynamic whenever she was conscious. Despite everything that had happened, 14 years of marriage had created automatic responses that kicked in when she needed comfort. I would find myself stroking her hair or holding her hand before remembering that this woman had been sleeping with other men, while I believed we had a solid relationship. The muscle memory of love persisted even after the emotional foundation had been obliterated. During the quiet hours when she slept peacefully and the machines hummed their electronic lullabies, I made the decision to use this time productively. If I was going to be stuck in this hospital room anyway, I might as well figure out what my next steps should be. The forced isolation gave me space to think through the practical aspects of ending a marriage, protecting my children, and rebuilding my life as a single father. But as I sat there watching her breathe through that oxygen mask, something else started happening to my brain. Every innocent memory from our marriage was suddenly suspect. Every late night at work, every girl's trip, every time she had seemed distant or distracted, now looked completely different through this new lens of betrayal. I realized I had been living with someone whose entire life might have been a carefully constructed lie. Detective work in aisle 7. That realization sent my brain into full detective mode, and I started questioning every memory that had once seemed perfectly innocent. I spent my third day in that hospital room staring at my unconscious wife and realizing I had probably been the most gullible husband in human history. The signs had been everywhere, practically neon lit, and I had missed every single one because I trusted her completely. My amateur investigation started with her phone, which the hospital staff had placed in the bedside table drawer along with her other personal effects from the accident. While she slept off another round of pain medication, I scrolled through months of text messages that suddenly looked very different through my new lens of suspicion. Every innocent text about working late now seemed like a coded mission from some cheating handbook I had never read. The most obvious clue sat right there in her recent call log. Multiple calls to and from a number I didn't recognize, including several that lasted over an hour during times when she claimed to be in meetings or running errands. Some of these marathon conversations had happened while I was home with the kids, meaning she had been conducting lengthy phone sessions with another man while I made dinner and helped with homework just a few rooms away. The audacity was almost impressive. The credit card statements told an even more damning story once I knew what to look for. Charges at restaurants during lunch hours when she claimed to be eating at her desk. Hotel bar purchases on evenings when she was supposedly at home with me watching television. Expensive lingerie purchases from stores she had never shopped at before, followed by romantic dinners at places we had never been together. She had basically been documenting her affair through our joint bank account while I paid the bills without reading them carefully. Her car became another source of evidence that I had somehow overlooked for months. The passenger seat was adjusted for someone much taller than either my wife or her female friends. There were coffee cups in the cup holders from places she claimed never to visit. Most damning of all, I found a man's jacket in her trunk that definitely didn't belong to me. When I had discovered it months earlier, she claimed it belonged to a coworker who had left it in her car after a group lunch. I had believed her completely and even offered to return it myself. Beyond these major discoveries, there was a whole trove of red flags I had somehow missed. Her social media accounts showed photos from nights out I had never heard about. Her work schedule had convenient gaps that corresponded with her mysterious phone calls. Email accounts I didn't know existed contained conversations that revealed ongoing relationships rather than casual encounters. The more I dug, the more I realized my wife had been operating an entirely separate life with the security awareness of someone who assumed she would never get caught. Every new piece of evidence I uncovered made me question my own intelligence and observational skills. How had I missed such obvious signs of deception for what appeared to be years rather than months? The answer was uncomfortable but simple. I had trusted her completely and interpreted everything through the lens of that trust. When someone you love gives you an explanation for their behavior, you want to believe them. You don't automatically assume they're lying to your face while planning their next betrayal. The most pathetic part of my investigation was realizing how many people probably knew about her cheating before I did. Her friends had been posting social media photos that showed her out with men who weren't her husband, tagged at locations during times when she told me she was somewhere else entirely. These images had been public for months, visible to anyone who bothered to look. The fact that no one had ever mentioned seeing my wife with other men suggested either incredible discretion or the assumption that I already knew about her behavior. My amateur detective work was revealing the scope of her deception, but I realized I needed professional help to understand the complete picture. There were gaps in her timeline that I couldn't fill, relationships that seemed to extend beyond what I could discover through basic snooping, and financial irregularities that suggested levels of dishonesty I wasn't equipped to investigate properly. The decision to hire a private investigator felt both necessary and humiliating. I was essentially paying someone else to document how thoroughly my wife had been deceiving me, but I needed to know the complete truth before making any major decisions about our future. If I was going to end our marriage and fight for custody of our children, I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with. My wife's recovery would give the investigator time to conduct a thorough examination of her activities while she remained safely sedated and unable to cover her tracks any further. I had uncovered enough evidence to know this wasn't a recent development or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a pattern of behavior that suggested my entire marriage had been built on lies I was too trusting to recognize. As I sat there watching her breathe through that oxygen mask, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life was probably wrong. The woman lying in that hospital bed wasn't the person I had married, or maybe she was exactly who she had always been and I had just been too blind to see it. Either way, I needed someone with professional skills to help me understand how deep this deception actually went. What I didn't realize was that my amateur investigation had barely scratched the surface of what a professional would uncover. The private eye's shocking discoveries. The private investigator I hired came recommended through my lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Sarah who specialized in marital infidelity cases. She had the kind of calm, professional demeanor that suggested she had seen every possible variation of spousal betrayal and nothing could surprise her anymore. When I explained my situation during our initial phone consultation, she asked pointed questions about my wife's behavior patterns that made me realize how much I had missed during my amateur detective phase. Sarah's first report arrived via encrypted email 3 days after I hired her, and the opening paragraph made my stomach drop. My wife's infidelity wasn't some recent development triggered by marital problems or a midlife crisis. The digital forensics showed evidence of extramarital relationships dating back at least 4 years, possibly longer. What I had discovered at Rebecca's house wasn't the beginning of her cheating, but apparently just the latest installment in an ongoing pattern of systematic deception. The investigation revealed that my wife had been maintaining a parallel dating life financed by a secret bank account. She had been redirecting portions of her paycheck into separate checking accounts that she used to fund her secret activities. The monthly statements showed regular expenditures at hotels, restaurants, and bars during times when she claimed to be working late or visiting her family. She had essentially been financing her affair lifestyle while contributing to our household expenses, creating a budget for betrayal that operated right under my nose. Her phone records revealed communication patterns that would have made a professional spy proud. She maintained separate devices for her extramarital activities, switching between phones depending on whether she was playing the role of devoted wife or available single woman. The call logs showed that she conducted her affair-related conversations during specific time windows, when she knew I would be busy with work or occupied with the children. Her operational security was sophisticated enough to avoid detection for years, which explained how I had remained completely oblivious to her double life. The investigation also uncovered evidence of her affair partners, and the scope was far beyond what I had prepared myself to handle. Sarah's forensic recovery of deleted phone content revealed communications with dozens of different men my wife had been involved with over the past several years, some simultaneously. These weren't random hookups, but sustained relationships that involved regular meetings, gift exchanges, and emotional intimacy that extended far beyond physical encounters. My wife had apparently been juggling multiple boyfriends while maintaining her role as mother and spouse, compartmentalizing her life with the precision of someone running a complex business operation. The most disturbing discovery was how many people had known about my wife's behavior while I remained completely in the dark. Sarah's investigation revealed that several of my wife's coworkers were aware of her extramarital activities and had even covered for her during office affairs. Her sister knew about at least 2 of her relationships and had provided alibis when my wife needed excuses for overnight absences. Even some of our mutual friends had witnessed her with other men at social events I didn't attend, but no one had felt obligated to inform me about what they had seen. The professional investigation painted a picture of someone I didn't recognize as the woman I had married and lived with for over a decade. My wife wasn't just cheating on me, she was living an entirely fabricated existence where our marriage served as convenient cover for her true priorities. The family photos on her legitimate social media accounts and her public displays of affection were apparently performance art designed to maintain her respectable reputation while she pursued her actual interests elsewhere. Sarah discovered that my wife had been conducting emotional affairs through online gaming platforms, social media groups, and professional networking sites that I had never suspected could be used for romantic purposes. She had developed intimate relationships with men across multiple states, some of whom believed they were her primary romantic partner. The depth of her deception extended beyond simple infidelity into what could only be described as serial emotional fraud, affecting multiple victims who thought they knew who she really was. The investigation revealed elaborate systems my wife had developed to maintain her various relationships without creating conflicts or scheduling problems. She kept detailed calendars that tracked her different boyfriends' availability, planned her lies weeks in advance, and maintained separate email accounts for each relationship to prevent communication mix-ups. The level of organization required to manage this operation was honestly impressive, though I wished she had applied that same attention to detail to our actual marriage. Sarah's forensic accounting uncovered financial irregularities that suggested my wife had been receiving gifts and monetary support from some of her affair partners. Unexplained deposits in her secret account corresponded with expensive purchases that she claimed were worth bonuses or gifts from her parents. She She had essentially been accepting payment for her romantic services, while telling me she was committed to our relationship and our future together. The most shocking revelation came buried in the middle of Sarah's third report, presented with the same clinical detachment she used for all her findings. The timeline of my wife's affairs overlapped significantly with the periods when our children were conceived. Her extramarital activities hadn't paused during her pregnancies or resumed afterward. They had continued throughout our entire marriage without interruption. Sarah recommended DNA testing for both children, noting that the timing of several relationships coincided with conception windows that made paternity questions not just possible but necessary. Reading that recommendation felt like being punched in the chest all over again. I had prepared myself for learning about my wife's infidelity, but the possibility that my children might not be biologically mine opened up a level of betrayal I hadn't imagined possible. The woman lying unconscious in that hospital bed hadn't just cheated on me. She had potentially deceived me about the most fundamental aspects of our family structure. As I sat there staring at Sarah's clinical recommendation for discrete DNA testing, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family might be built on lies. The investigation had revealed the scope of my wife's deception, but now I faced the terrifying possibility that the children I loved more than life itself might not actually be mine. My lawyer would need to know about this development, and the conversation we were going to have would determine not just the future of my marriage but potentially my relationship with my kids as well. The paternity bomb. The DNA testing felt like a formality when my lawyer first suggested it during our initial divorce consultation. She explained that paternity confirmation was standard procedure in cases involving infidelity, especially when child support and custody arrangements were at stake. I nodded along while she described the process, assuming this would be the easiest part of documenting my wife's betrayal. After everything Sarah's investigation had revealed about my wife's systematic deception, I figured I should cover all the bases even though I felt completely confident about being the biological father of both my children. The testing itself was surprisingly simple. My son Michael was 7 and my daughter Carrie was 4, both too young to understand why Daddy needed to collect samples for what I told them was a health checkup. They cooperated cheerfully while I tried not to think about the implications of what I was doing. Waiting for the results gave me time to consider scenarios I hoped I would never have to face. The rational part of my brain insisted that both children were obviously mine, but Sarah's investigation had revealed depths of deception I hadn't imagined possible, so I tried to prepare myself mentally for any outcome. The first email arrived on a Thursday afternoon, while I sat in my office pretending to focus on work instead of obsessively checking my phone. The subject line read DNA analysis results, case 47291, with no indication of what those results contained. My hands shook slightly as I opened the attachment containing Michael's paternity report. The technical language was dense and clinical, but the conclusion was clear and unambiguous. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Michael was definitely my biological son. Relief flooded through me as I read and reread the confirmation that my relationship with my boy remained unchanged by his mother's betrayal. Whatever else happened during the divorce proceedings, I would still be Michael's father in every sense that mattered. The biological connection I had never questioned was scientifically confirmed, providing one stable foundation in the chaos that had become my life. The second email arrived 3 hours later with the same clinical subject line format. I opened Carrie's results while sitting in my car in the parking lot outside my office building, expecting another routine confirmation that would allow me to move forward with divorce planning. Instead, the report contained words that made my vision blur and my stomach drop into some bottomless pit. Probability of paternity, 0%. The man I had believed was my daughter's biological father was actually a complete genetic stranger. I stared at the screen for several minutes, reading the same devastating conclusion over and over while my brain refused to process what it meant. I had spent 4 years loving someone else's child. Her conception had occurred during one of my wife's affairs, meaning another man was her actual biological father while I had been playing house with someone else's offspring. The physical reaction hit me before the emotional one did. I barely managed to open my car door before vomiting onto the asphalt, my body rejecting this information the same way it would reject poison. Parking lots have never been lower points of my life, but there I was dry heaving next to my Honda while other drivers stared and wondered if I was having some kind of medical emergency. In a way, I was. Learning that your child isn't actually your child creates a unique type of grief that combines loss, betrayal, and identity crisis into one overwhelming emotional hurricane. Everything I thought I knew about my family's structure had just been revealed as an elaborate fiction maintained by my wife's lies. My wife had been sleeping with other men during the time period when Carrie was conceived, then allowed me to believe I was the father while she knew the truth. She had watched me bond with this child, celebrate her birth, lose sleep during her infancy, and build my identity around being her father, all while knowing that another man was her actual biological parent. The drive home took twice as long as usual, because I kept having to pull over when waves of nausea and dizziness made it unsafe to continue. Each red light gave me more time to think about the implications of what I had learned. The worst part was confronting my feelings about Carrie herself, who remained the same sweet, funny, affectionate little girl she had always been regardless of what some laboratory report said about her DNA. I loved her completely and unconditionally, but now that love felt complicated by the knowledge that our entire relationship was built on deception. My lawyer's reaction when I called her with the results confirmed how significantly this discovery changed our legal strategy. Her voice shifted into what I recognized as her courtroom tone as she explained that paternity fraud opened up additional avenues for pursuing damages against my wife. She could file motions to remove my name from Carrie's birth certificate, seek reimbursement for child support I had never been legally obligated to pay, and use this evidence to demonstrate the comprehensive nature of my wife's deception. But then she asked the question that had been forming in my mind since I first read those devastating results. Did I want to pursue my legal right to disavow paternity, or did I want to take steps to formalize my relationship with Carrie through adoption proceedings? The law recognized that I had been deceived about her biological parentage, but it also provided mechanisms for men who chose to remain fathers despite genetic evidence to the contrary. The answer came to me immediately, even through the fog of grief and betrayal. Carrie had done nothing wrong and deserved a father who chose to love her regardless of biology. My wife's lies didn't change my feelings about the little girl who ran to me when she got hurt, who fell asleep in my lap during bedtime stories, who called me daddy with complete trust and affection. If anything, she needed protection from the chaos her mother had created. I instructed my lawyer to begin the legal process of removing my name from Carrie's birth certificate, not to abandon her but to clear the way for adopting her properly. She would remain my daughter, but this time the relationship would be based on choice rather than deception. The DNA results had given me the ammunition I needed for the divorce proceedings, but they had also created a new problem. My wife still had no idea that I knew about Carrie's paternity, and eventually we were going to have to sit down and discuss the future of our family. That conversation was going to require more preparation than I had given to any discussion in my entire life. The confrontation from hell. My wife had been out of the hospital for 2 weeks when my lawyer finally arranged the meeting that both of us had been dreading. The conference room at her law office felt sterile and formal, designed to keep emotions contained during discussions that could easily spiral into screaming matches. My wife sat across from me with her own attorney, looking pale and fragile with her left arm still in a sling from the accident. She kept glancing at the manila folder my lawyer had placed on the table between us, probably sensing that whatever it contained would make this conversation significantly worse than she had anticipated. That confidence evaporated the moment my lawyer opened the manila folder and slid the DNA test results across the table. My wife stared at the documents for several seconds without touching them, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and absolute horror as she realized what she was looking at. Her attorney leaned over to read the reports, and I watched his professional composure crack slightly when he understood the implications of what we had just presented. My wife's first reaction was complete denial, delivered in a voice that sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as everyone else in the room. She insisted there had to be some mistake with the testing, that laboratories made errors all the time, and that we should run the tests again through a different facility. Her hands trembled as she finally picked up the paternity reports, reading them multiple times as if the results might change if she stared at them long enough. When denial stopped working, she shifted to minimization tactics that made my blood pressure spike dangerously high. She claimed that Carrie's paternity didn't really matter because I was the only father figure the child had ever known, and biology shouldn't determine family relationships anyway. She suggested we could just pretend this conversation had never happened and continue raising Carrie together as if nothing had changed. The casual way she dismissed 4 years of lies about my daughter's parentage showed a level of callousness that left me speechless. My lawyer asked the question that had been burning in my mind since I first read those test results. If my wife had been so careful about protection during her affairs, how exactly had she managed to get pregnant with another man's child? The silence that followed this inquiry stretched long enough to become uncomfortable for everyone in the room. My wife stared at her hands while her attorney shuffled papers and avoided eye contact with anyone. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper and contained an admission that hit me like another physical blow. She said she didn't know for sure who Carrie's biological father might be because there had been multiple men during the relevant time period. The clinical way she delivered this information, like she was discussing a scheduling conflict rather than paternity fraud, revealed a side of her personality I had never encountered during our marriage. My rage at that moment was so intense that I had to grip the edges of my chair to keep from lunging across the table. This woman had not only cheated on me repeatedly and lied about our daughter's parentage, but she had been so promiscuous during the conception period that she couldn't even narrow down the list of potential fathers. Every assumption I had made about her character, her values, and her respect for our marriage had been completely wrong. I asked directly how many men she had been involved with over the course of our marriage, expecting her to claim it was just a few isolated incidents that got out of hand. Instead, she admitted that she had lost count somewhere around 12 different partners, though she insisted that most of them were just brief encounters that didn't mean anything significant. The number hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. 12 men that she could remember, with the implication that there might have been others she had forgotten about entirely. While I had been faithful to our marriage vows and believed we had a solid relationship, my wife had apparently been running through partners like she was collecting baseball cards. The mathematical reality of her admission meant she had been cheating on me roughly once every few months for the majority of our marriage. Her attempts to justify this behavior revealed a thought process that belonged to someone I didn't recognize as the woman I had married. She claimed that physical relationships with other men didn't affect her love for me, that she compartmentalized her affairs so they wouldn't interfere with our family life, and that she never intended for any of these encounters to threaten our marriage. Each explanation made less sense than the previous one and demonstrated a capacity for self-deception that matched her talent for deceiving others. The meeting concluded with my wife making one final attempt to negotiate some kind of reconciliation, suggesting we could work through these issues with counseling and time. She seemed genuinely shocked when I explained that our marriage had been over the moment I found her in that guest room, and that this conversation was about legal formalities rather than relationship repair. Her injured expression suggested she still didn't understand the magnitude of what she had done, or why forgiveness wasn't an option. Walking out of that conference room, I realized that the woman sitting across from me had been a complete stranger throughout our entire relationship. The person I thought I had married, the mother I believed was raising our children with shared values and mutual respect, had never actually existed. I had been living with an elaborate fiction created by someone whose real priorities and character were completely hidden from me. At that moment, I realized I had never known this woman at all. What I did know was that she was about to discover just how expensive her lies were going to be. The divorce from hell. The divorce proceedings began 3 weeks later, and my lawyer warned me to prepare for a battle that could drag on for months. My wife had initially signaled through her attorney that she wanted to fight for joint custody of both children and a significant portion of our marital assets. Given everything we had discovered about her behavior and the paternity fraud, I was determined to make this legal process as thorough and unforgiving as possible. My legal team assembled a case file that read like a masterclass in documenting infidelity and fraud. Sarah's private investigation had provided phone records, financial statements, social media evidence, and witness testimonies that painted a complete picture of my wife's double life. We had documentation of her secret bank accounts, her dating profiles, her hotel receipts, and her elaborate systems for maintaining multiple relationships simultaneously. The evidence was so comprehensive that my lawyer joked about having enough material to write a handbook on how not to conduct an extramarital affair. The first major advantage in my favor was the prenuptial agreement I had insisted on before our wedding, largely because I had inherited significant assets from my grandfather's estate. My wife had signed the document willingly at the time, probably assuming it would never become relevant to our relationship. Now, that same agreement protected my premarital wealth from being divided during the divorce proceedings, leaving her with access only to assets we had accumulated together during our marriage. My prenuptial agreement, the overwhelming evidence of fraud, and the DNA bombshell gave me clear upper hand in every negotiation. Her lawyer found himself in the impossible position of defending a client whose behavior was essentially indefensible in family court. He tried various strategies to minimize the impact of her infidelity, but the paternity fraud and financial deception created legal complications that went far beyond simple adultery. His client hadn't just cheated on her husband, she had committed fraud that affected child support obligations and parental rights. The custody arrangements were decided quickly once the judge reviewed our evidence. I was awarded full custody of both children, including Carrie despite the DNA results, while my ex-wife received supervised visitation rights only. The asset division was equally straightforward given the prenuptial agreement and her complete lack of bargaining power. She walked away with essentially nothing except court-ordered visitation and a monthly payment plan for paternity fraud damages that would remind her of her choices for years to come. My strategy throughout the proceedings was to make this divorce as expensive and painful as possible for my ex-wife, not out of pure vindictiveness but to ensure she faced real consequences for her actions. She had destroyed our family and betrayed our children through her selfish choices, and I wanted the legal system to reflect the magnitude of what she had done. Every motion we filed, every piece of evidence we presented, and every legal argument we made was designed to demonstrate that her behavior had been deliberate, sustained, and devastating to everyone involved. The irony of her position became apparent as the proceedings continued, and her lawyer struggled to find any leverage to improve her situation. She had no significant assets to protect, no evidence of my wrongdoing to present as counterarguments, and no moral high ground to claim given the comprehensive documentation of her deception. Her injuries from the car accident prevented her from working full-time, making her financially dependent on whatever settlement she could negotiate. Meanwhile, I had stable employment, protected assets, and a legal case that looked stronger with every document we submitted. The judge assigned to our case had clearly seen similar situations before, but even he seemed surprised by the comprehensive nature of my wife's deception. During the final hearing, he commented that the evidence presented one of the most thorough cases of marital fraud he had encountered in his years on the family court bench. His tone suggested that he viewed my wife's behavior not just as personal betrayal, but as a systematic violation of the legal and social contracts that define marriage and parenthood. The settlement negotiations reflected my wife's complete lack of bargaining power in the situation. Her lawyer proposed several arrangements that would have given her shared custody and ongoing financial support, but my legal team rejected these offers immediately. We countered with terms that gave me full custody of both children, limited her to supervised visitation, and required her to pay me damages for the paternity fraud. She had no choice but to accept conditions that left her with essentially nothing except the legal right to see her children under court supervision. If you're enjoying this roller coaster, hit like so we can find out what happens next. The final divorce decree was signed on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom that felt too ordinary for the magnitude of what was being decided. The judge read through the custody arrangements, asset division, and fraud damages in 15 minutes with the same matter-of-fact tone he probably used for routine traffic violations. My ex-wife sat next to her lawyer looking defeated and resigned, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with tissues, but no longer attempting to argue for better terms. Within a quarter hour, our 14-year marriage was officially dissolved, and she was legally required to pay me restitution for her years of deception. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt a mixture of relief and emptiness that surprised me with its intensity. The legal battle was over, but the emotional work of rebuilding my life as a single father was just beginning. My ex-wife drove away in her car with a court-ordered visitation schedule that would remind her of her choices every month. The justice system had held her accountable in the most complete way possible, but no amount of legal victory could undo the damage she had caused to our family. The hardest part was knowing that the real work was only just beginning. The aftermath and new beginnings. Rebuilding my life as a single father meant learning entirely new rhythms while helping my children adjust to a reality that looked nothing like what they had known before. I had full custody of both Michael and Carrie, which transformed my days into the beautiful chaos of solo parenthood. School pickup lines, bedtime stories, homework battles, and endless loads of laundry became my new normal. The house felt different without my ex-wife's presence, but it was a good different. The tension that had been building for months without me realizing it was finally gone, replaced by the simple routines of a father raising his children. Carrie's adoption process took 6 months to complete, but the paperwork was just a formality that confirmed what my heart already knew. She was my daughter in every way that mattered, and no DNA test could change that fundamental truth. The day the judge signed the final adoption papers, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice. I had chosen to be her father before I knew she wasn't genetically mine, and I was choosing to be her father now with full knowledge of the circumstances. That decision felt more meaningful than any accident of genetics ever could. Both kids adapted to our new life with the resilience that children seem to possess naturally. Michael asked direct questions about why mommy didn't live with us anymore, and I gave him age-appropriate answers about people sometimes making choices that hurt their families. Carrie was young enough that the transition felt normal to her rather than traumatic. She accepted that daddy was taking care of everything now with the matter-of-fact acceptance that 4-year-olds bring to most situations. Their ability to roll with these massive changes reminded me that children are often stronger than the adults who worry about protecting them. My ex-wife's court-mandated supervised visits became increasingly sporadic as the months passed. She would show up for the scheduled 2-hour sessions at the Family Services Center, spend awkward time with the kids under the watchful eye of a social worker, then disappear for weeks at a time. The children stopped asking when they would see mommy again, which broke my heart and relieved me simultaneously. Her inconsistency was creating exactly the kind of emotional damage I had hoped to prevent by fighting for full custody. The social consequences of her behavior played out swiftly in our small town. Our mutual friends chose sides quickly once the details became known, with most expressing genuine shock at learning about her double life. Her own family distanced themselves after learning about the scope of her deception, with her parents expressing more concern for their grandchildren than for their daughter's situation. She struggled to rebuild any kind of normal social or professional life, partly because of her injuries from the accident and partly because her reputation preceded her everywhere she went. The decision to remain single wasn't born from bitterness or fear of being hurt again, but from a genuine desire to focus completely on raising my children. Dating felt like an unnecessary complication when I was still learning how to be a single father and helping my kids adjust to their new reality. I had spent 14 years of my life devoted to someone who turned out to be a complete stranger, and the idea of opening myself up to that kind of vulnerability again held no appeal. My children needed stability and consistency, not the uncertainty that comes with introducing new romantic relationships into their lives. Michael started asking more sophisticated questions as he got older, wanting to understand why his mother had made the choices she did, and whether those choices meant something was wrong with their family. I learned to give him honest answers that acknowledged the complexity of adult relationships without burdening him with details he wasn't ready to handle. He began to understand that some people make selfish decisions that hurt the people they're supposed to love, and that those decisions reflect on the person making them rather than on the people who get hurt. Harry's questions were simpler but somehow more profound. She wanted to know if I was really her daddy even though she didn't look exactly like me, and whether I would always take care of her no matter what. Those conversations were the easiest ones to handle because the answers came straight from my heart without any need for careful phrasing or age-appropriate explanations. Yes, I was really her daddy because I chose to be. Yes, I would always take care of her no matter what happened. Those promises were the most important ones I had ever made. The news that my ex-wife was moving abroad came through her lawyer rather than from her directly. She had apparently met someone online and was planning to relocate permanently. The children's supervised visitation would obviously end, but she wasn't requesting any changes to the custody arrangement or asking to take them with her. She was simply disappearing from their lives the same way she had been emotionally absent during our marriage. Her departure felt like the final chapter closing on a book I was ready to stop reading. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I found myself sitting in the same kitchen where this whole nightmare had started, watching my children eat breakfast before school and marveling at how normal everything felt. The drama and chaos of those early months had settled into routines that felt sustainable and peaceful. Michael was thriving in 2nd grade, Carrie was becoming more independent and confident in kindergarten, and I had learned that being a single father suited me better than being a married man ever had. This morning, I braided Carrie's hair before school while Michael packed his own lunch, and the simple normalcy of these moments felt like peace at last. The man who had discovered his wife's betrayal in that guest room no longer existed, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the most devastating experiences reveal truths you never knew you needed to learn. Who knew marriage counseling should start with hospital room confessions? Looking back on this whole nightmare, I realized that discovering my wife's betrayal was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to understand that being a father has nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with showing up every single day. The man who walked into that guest room and found his world shattered was living a lie without knowing it. The man who chose to adopt his daughter after learning she wasn't biologically his discovered what real love actually means. Sometimes life destroys everything you thought you wanted so you can discover what you actually need. If you've ever faced an awkward shock, drop a comment below and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life tales.